the American cigar that was everywhere until it vanished. The lost era of Optimo, cold open. There was a time when you could not walk down a city block in America without seeing its name, painted in gold letters above tobacco shop doors, burning between the fingers of Babe Ruth between innings. Sitting unlit in the breast pocket of Winston Churchill's coat during a private visit to the United States. The name was Optimo. For most of the 20th century, it was one of the most recognized cigar brands in the country, a name so common on American storefronts that entire neighborhoods used its signs as landmarks. And then, quietly, the version of Optimo that made it legendary simply stopped existing. Not with an explosion, not with a scandal. It slipped away the way most great things do, a little at a time, until one day it was gone, and almost nobody noticed the exact moment it happened. This is the story of how that happened. And by the end, you will understand why the ghost of that old cigar is still standing on street corners in New York City today, wearing a completely different face. Why this cigar matters. To understand why Optimo deserves to be remembered, you have to understand what a cigar brand actually was in the early 20th century. It wasn't a product, it was a signature. A cigar told people who you were before you said a word. Optimo wasn't a boutique curiosity smoked by a handful of collectors. It was mass, it was visible, and it was trusted, which, in the cigar trade, is far harder to earn than exclusivity. The brand's factories at their peak employed over 1,000 workers, and its cigars traveled through a distribution network that stretched across the entire country. Its most famous smoker was Babe Ruth, the biggest sports celebrity America had ever produced, photographed again and again with an Optimo between his teeth. Its admirers reportedly also included Winston Churchill, a man whose relationship with cigars was practically a second career. When a brand can claim a baseball god and a wartime prime minister as customers, it has stopped being a product and become a piece of culture. And there's something else, something most people driving through American cities have seen without knowing what they were looking at. Painted on the sides of old buildings in New York and other cities, faded but still legible, are ghost signs bearing the Optimo name. They're called privilege signs, advertisements the company gave to shop owners for free in exchange for permanent branding on their walls. Coca-Cola did it. So did Optimo. Decades later, those signs are the last physical fingerprints of an empire that otherwise vanished from public memory. But to understand how a brand goes from Churchill's pocket to a fading wall in Chinatown, you have to go back to where it started, because this story doesn't begin in America at all. The origin story. The man behind Optimo was Antonio Santaella, born in 1863 in Seville, in the Andalusia region of Spain. At 17 years old, he left home and sailed for Cuba, the beating heart of the cigar world, where the tobacco fields of the Vuelta Abajo region were already producing some of the finest leaf on earth. It was in Cuba, in the 1870s and the 1880s, that Santaella learned the trade that would define his life. Cigar rolling in that era was not simply a manufacturing skill, it was closer to a craft guild, passed down through apprenticeship, built on an intimate understanding of leaf, humidity, and fermentation that took years to master. By the mid-1880s, Santaella had made the leap that thousands of Cuban-trained cigar men made in that period. He brought his knowledge north, first opening a factory operation in Chicago, before ultimately relocating his growing company toward Florida, settling operations in Tampa by 1900. Tampa, at the turn of the century, was becoming America's cigar capital, a city built almost entirely around hand-rolled tobacco, filled with immigrant rollers from Cuba and Spain who brought the old world craft with them. It was fertile ground for a business like Santaella's, and under the name A. Santaella and Company, his operation grew into one of the largest and most profitable cigar manufacturers in the city, producing several brands, Flor Mia, Aluro, El Capitan General, Centropolis, but none would eclipse the one called Optimo. But even at this early stage, the company's fortunes were more fragile than they appeared. The Golden Age. In April 1904, a fire that started at a bowling alley on the other side of West Tampa tore through the neighborhood, destroying more than 100 buildings, including 5 cigar factories. Santaella's brand new factory, along with its entire tobacco stock, burned to the ground just 1 month after the company had moved in. He rebuilt, not smaller, larger. Santaella bought up the entire surrounding block, demolished what remained, and constructed a 58,000 square foot factory that became, for a time, the largest cigar manufacturing building in West Tampa. It still stands today, a red brick monument to a company most people have forgotten existed. This is where Optimo entered its true golden age. Through the 1920s, the company expanded aggressively, opening branch factories in Key West, New Orleans, and Waycross, Georgia, and by 1922 employed over 1,000 workers across its operations. 6 years later, in 1928, the company took over the vacant Samuel Wass Davis factory building as well, absorbing the footprint of a competitor that had already relocated out of Tampa entirely. This was also the era that cemented Optimo's celebrity connections, Babe Ruth's association with the brand, and reportedly Churchill's, turning the cigar into shorthand for a certain kind of confident American success. Picture what that actually meant on the ground. In the 1920s and 1930s, a cigar wasn't a private indulgence, it was a public performance. Men lit them at ballparks, in hotel lobbies, on the floors of political conventions. To be photographed with a particular brand between your fingers was to make a small, unspoken statement about who you were. Babe Ruth, the single most photographed athlete in the country, chose Optimo again and again, and every photograph that circulated in newspapers was, in effect, free advertising more powerful than anything the company could have paid for. By the 1950s, the Optimo name had become so ubiquitous on American storefronts that the company began installing those painted privilege signs across cities, a marketing strategy typically reserved for the biggest, most trusted consumer brands in the country. To have your name permanently painted on hundreds of independent shop fronts wasn't advertising, it was proof you'd already won. Store owners didn't pay for these signs, they competed for the privilege of hosting one, because a wall bearing the Optimo name instantly signaled to customers that this was a serious tobacco shop stocked with a trusted brand. And yet, behind that gold-lettered success, the company was quietly changing in ways that would eventually erase the very thing that made it legendary. The hidden story. Here is what most cigar drinkers, even serious ones, don't know about Optimo's private history. The company Santaella built was never as stable as its public image suggested. Between 1919 and 1922, labor unrest repeatedly disrupted operations. Cigar manufacturing in this era relied on skilled hand rollers, many of them organized and increasingly willing to strike over wages and conditions, a wave of labor conflict that swept through Tampa's cigar industry and forced Santaella to open and close branch factories as the company searched for stability. This was the uncomfortable truth beneath the Golden Age. Even at its peak, the empire was being managed through crisis, not just success. There's a second hidden thread in this story, and it's about craftsmanship itself. In 1946, the company opened a new factory in Clearwater, Florida, specifically to produce the Optimo brand, but by then, cigar manufacturing across America was shifting decisively toward machine production. The hand-rolled tradition that Santaella had carried out of Cuba as a teenager was, brand by brand, being replaced by mechanized cigar making, faster, cheaper, and far less dependent on the generational skill of a trained roller. Then, in 1948, Antonio Santaella died in Tampa at the age of 85. His son-in-law took over management of the company, but the founder, who had personally carried the craft from the tobacco fields of the Vuelta a Bajo to the factories of Florida, was gone. The company he built would continue, the world that made it would not. Think about what that transition actually meant. Santaella wasn't a distant investor who had bought his way into the tobacco business. He was a man who had rolled cigars with his own hands as a teenager in Cuba, who understood the leaf on a physical level no spreadsheet could replicate. Every founder-led company carries an invisible signature, a set of instincts about quality that never get written down, because the person who has them doesn't think of them as rules, just as how things are done. When Santaella died, that signature didn't transfer. It simply stopped being renewed with each new generation of leadership, and the company that continued under his son-in-law was, structurally, the same business, but it was no longer being steered by the hands that built it. What happened next wasn't a single dramatic collapse. It was something slower, and in some ways, harder to notice until it was already finished. The fall. After Santaella's death, the company eventually passed into the hands of Universal Cigar Company. The Clearwater factory that had been built specifically to produce Optimo cigars kept running, remarkably, all the way until 1989. But the cigar industry around it had transformed almost beyond recognition. America's taste in tobacco was shifting. Premium hand-rolled cigars were being squeezed by mass-market machine-made products on one side, and by the declining cultural status of cigar smoking generally on the other, as cigarette consumption dominated the mid-century tobacco market. The kind of brand loyalty that had once put Optimo's name on hundreds of shop fronts across America no longer had the same cultural gravity. Then, in 1986, Swisher International, already building itself into what would become the largest cigar company in the world by volume, acquired Universal Cigar Company, and with it, the Optimo name. This is the moment the original Optimo effectively disappeared, not the brand name. That survived and still exists on shelves today. What vanished was everything that had made it legendary. The Tampa factory built from Cuban tradition, the labor of 1,000 workers, the golden age glamour of Babe Ruth and Churchill, the direct line back to a 17-year-old immigrant who had learned to roll tobacco by hand in the Vuelta a Bajo. Under Swisher, Optimo was reborn as something else entirely, a mass-market, machine-made cigarillo sold in flavors like grape, mango, and cream, aimed at an entirely different customer than the one who had once carried it in a Churchillian breast pocket. The old Optimo didn't die in a headline. It was absorbed, quietly, into a bigger company's product catalog, and the story of the man who built it faded from public memory almost as fast as the paint on those old privilege signs. The collector's hunt. So what's left to actually search for? This is where Optimo becomes genuinely fascinating to collectors and historians, rather than casual cigar drinkers, because so little of the old-era material survives in any organized way. Unlike Cuban legends such as Partagas or Por la Reñaga, whose vintage boxes are catalogued and traded in established collector circles, Optimo material from before 1986 exists mostly by accident. A cigar box found in an estate sale, an old tin discovered in a demolished storefront, a photograph of Babe Ruth that happens to show the band on his cigar. The physical proof of the brand's golden age survives mainly in architecture rather than tobacco, and the surviving Tampa factory building at 1906 North Armenia Avenue, later converted into art studios and warehouse space, stands as one of the only tangible monuments to the company's scale. And scattered across cities, those fading privilege signs, painted advertisements from the 1930s through the 1960s, remain the most visible, if accidental, archive of just how large the Optimo name once was. Historians and preservationists researching Tampa's cigar factory heritage have specifically pointed to these buildings as at-risk pieces of an industry that otherwise left few physical traces behind. For collectors, authentication is the real challenge. Because Optimo wasn't a single-family Cuban house with a tightly controlled paper trail, and because the brand changed hands and manufacturing methods multiple times across nearly a century, dating a surviving box or determining whether a given tin predates the 1986 Swisher acquisition often comes down to label design, factory stamps, and educated guesswork rather than documented certainty. It's a detective's hobby more than a collector's market, which, for a certain kind of history obsessive, is exactly the appeal. There's also a quieter kind of hunting happening, not by cigar collectors at all, but by urban historians and preservationists tracing the old privilege signs themselves. Because these were painted directly onto brick, most of them were never meant to survive this long. They were commercial advertisements, not monuments, and building owners routinely painted over or demolished them without a second thought. The ones that remain visible today have survived by accident, protected by decades of grime, or simply overlooked by renovation crews, which makes each surviving sign a small, unintentional artifact of a marketing era that has almost entirely vanished from American cities. Local historical societies and sign hunters have documented several of these locations, treating faded wall advertisements the way archaeologists treat pottery shards. Incomplete evidence of an entire vanished economy, pieced together one wall at a time. And then there is the harder question, the one that actually keeps this story alive for researchers. How much of the factory record from before 1986 even survives at all? Corporate acquisitions in the mid to late 20th century were rarely gentle with archives. When Universal Cigar sold to Swisher, there was no guarantee that production ledgers, blend formulas, or internal company records from the Santaella era were preserved as historical documents rather than simply discarded as outdated paperwork. That absence is itself part of the mystery. A brand this visible, this photographed, this woven into celebrity culture, and yet so thin on documented internal history that most of what we know about its operations comes from newspaper archives, city preservation surveys, and the physical buildings left standing, rather than from the company's own records. The legacy and final reveal. Here's the twist this story has been building toward. Optimo never actually disappeared. Walk through certain neighborhoods in New York City today and you'll still find its name on cigarillo packs sold at corner bodegas, wrapped in flavors like green candela and cognac, carrying a brand story now built around a completely different chapter of American culture. The modern company traces a proud connection to the rise of New York hip-hop, citing the late notorious B.I.G. as one of the faces associated with the brand's second life on those same city street corners where its privilege signs once hung. That's the part almost nobody puts together. The same name that once sat in Winston Churchill's pocket now sits in a very different pocket on a very different corner, telling a completely different story to a completely different generation, and most of the people buying it today have no idea the brand has any history at all before the 1990s. Some cigars disappear because people forget them. This one disappeared because it became two entirely different legends, wearing the same name, separated by a fire, a death, a corporate sale, and 60 years of American history, and almost nobody who has smoked one in either era has ever heard the other half of the story.